apologize, I have to rush off to another event which is clashing, and so I'm going to move very fast, and if you have any questions, I'd quickly like to take them before I have to leave at 10:30. Let me quickly comment on two things. One, as far as nuclear is concerned, I participated with Dr. Zamzam only 1 week ago in a discussion, and we will get arguing again whether it's on or off. And the official position is, it's not really on, but we are already looking at trying agreements with the Americans for technology agreements and all that. You can read what it is there. So they're basically planning to go, but they will go through the motions of a consultation. They've already identified 5 sites in Peninsular Malaysia, which are all at least 10 meters above sea level. That's all the information that I know. Okay. Second point, quickly to comment on what Hilary just mentioned about this net sink issue. Yes, I was in the steering committee, and I really sat through and made sure I'm convinced now that for the year 2000, yes, because of LULUCF calculation, we were net sinks. But by 2007, in NC2, we are net emitters now. So the emissions are going up, while the capabilities of the sinks are shrinking or being fixed. So we are, as far as 2007 is concerned, we are net emitters. Let me quickly get to my presentation. I want to first emphasize that I think we need to be clear about energy, because there's always a confusion among lay people and even activists between electricity and energy. Many people think electricity is energy alone. Energy is more than electricity, and that's what I purposely emphasize. We should look in terms of final end use and ask ourselves, what do we need energy for? We need for low temperature heat, high temperature heat, motive power, light, cooling, and communication. These are the end uses. Then we look for where does the energy come. When you examine carefully, almost all energy comes from the sun. Oil and what is oil and gas, which was actually biomass that came from photosynthesis, got compressed over the years, first became oil, coal, then became oil, and some of it became gas. The only one that is not from the sun is nuclear. It's a byproduct of a weapon of mass destruction. Look at the history of nuclear. Never forget that. It's a byproduct. And you remember Eisenhower's atoms for peace. That was a way to justify nuclear weapons research while giving you a facade of energy. So nuclear was never developed for electricity. Electricity is a pleasant phase of the horrible weapons of mass destruction, actually. And it's actually funded, all the development is actually funded by nuclear weapons research itself. A lot of people forget that. That's why many of the development costs are cheap, already observed, and nuclear weapons. And the Ministry of Defense have huge budgets. They never explain to you how much of it goes for nuclear. And the intermediate form of energy is electricity. So electricity is not primary energy, it's not energy, it's an intermediate form of energy. It has to be generated. It does not exist in nature. Now, what are the adverse impacts of energy? Very quickly, during extraction, you have marine pollution, you have landscape destruction, you have biodiversity loss, you have occupational diseases among workers. Many people ignore these occupational diseases. During transmission, you have electromagnetic radiation, you have spills from pipelines and tankers, and during use, we have air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions whenever any form of fossil fuel is combusted, water pollution from excess heat and effluents, wastages during conversion. A lot of people forget that when you say, for example, boil water, convert electricity into heat, that's a massive loss of energy. It's not all the energy is used for heat. And again, there are occupational diseases. Now, I wanted to show you this particular chart to give you an idea of where we stand in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of energy, CO2. You look, the CO2 second highest is actually the transport sector. First is energy industry, that means electricity generating industry. Second is the transport sector. That more or less has not changed. Previous to that, in 1994, when I looked at the figures, I was also on the committee then, that time, transport was, but industries as a whole, they did not separate energy industries from other industries as a whole were the highest also, and transport was the second highest. And that's why when we talk of energy conservation, we can never ever ignore the transport sector, because they are massive users of energy. does energy conservation, because I'm going to talk about energy conservation rather than consumption per se. It cuts down the supply demand, lesser amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, reduce air pollution, better water quality, less species and natural ecosystems destroyed, occupational diseases will obviously drop, and there's less noise pollution because with more efficient equipment and processes, they generate less noise. That's a direct correlation in terms of efficiency. And so why do we seek? I don't have to tell you all these things. It's our own self-interest. And our lifestyles will benefit. Now wastages occur at all levels and all forms of energy because of heavy subsidies. And yesterday's budget worsened the situation. The subsidies are even increased. Petroleum is wasted in most private motorized vehicles, whether they are bikes or motorboats. Electricity is wasted in households, from households to hotels. And luckily Mohideen was able to build the air conditioning down on this place because every other place I go to, air conditioning is terrible. You are freezing. And then less than 10 government buildings, in my opinion, meet the proposed electricity intensity standards of 100 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. Now carbon intensity, these are some figures that I could share with you. Malaysia has a figure of 1.6 kg of CO2 per US dollar of GDP, while the world average is 0.77. This was taken by a presentation prepared by the Carbon Capture and Storage Center based in Australia. And it would require major efforts in energy production to reach the world proposed level of 6 to 336 grams, not kilograms, grams in 2050. That's the target that the world is aiming for. Right? Now, yet some energy planners, and this was actually Zamzam I was very unhappy with, he was suggesting that Malaysia should increase its energy consumption per person. Of current figure is 3.67 megawatt hours to Singapore's 8.5 megawatt hours. In other words, we should more than double our per capita energy consumption. Right? When I would argue we need to bring our thing down, right? And this is doubling. Because we want to be a developed country. And Singapore is a developed country. In fact, Japan's figure is higher. Japan's figure was, I think, 9 point something megawatt. So that's the argument. If you want to be a developed country, we must achieve those targets of energy consumption. That's how development is measured. Now, I want to share with you the results of a study that we did in PJ of 50 households. And we found for an average consumption of 2,098 kilowatt hours, the biggest consumption was fuel. If you look, the purple, the yellow, and the pale green are different forms of fuel usage. And therefore, when people study energy consumption at household level, they only focus to the internal household. They forget the energy that people use for going to work, in schools, going shopping and all that. So almost 70% of the energy is petroleum. Electricity is very much, and electricity is much smaller. And among electricity, you find the biggest users are air conditioners, refrigerators, and electrical heaters. Now, there's another breakdown for an average electricity consumption. You find cooling, basically is air conditioning. You find heating, which is electrical water heaters, very few use solar water heaters. And then you find the refrigerator. There's no point tinkering around with bulbs, and that's why I always laugh with people who say, oh, we will get people to save energy by changing to bulbs. No point. Go and tackle the three biggest ones. So, in other words, the most important thing is you must do it audit. House will differ, range from house to house. Depends how many refrigerators you have, how many air conditioners you have, and all this sort of thing. Or you don't have an air conditioner. Now, energy usage in Malaysian urban households, much of it is in the form of electrical appliances, some in the form of LPG for cooking, a little direct solar in water heaters, petrol for cars, sports utility vehicles, motorbikes, and the demand for cooling is rising with urban heat islands. People will say, oh, it's getting hotter, therefore must have air conditioning. Now, I always ask you to think about boiling water in a kettle because that gives you a very good way of illustrating how energy thinking is so ridiculous. We only look very often at the end point. We never look at the energy system. For example, to boil 1 cup of water using electricity, and to boil the same using electricity, or to use electricity generated from the most neutral form, which is hydro. You look at the transmission losses, convert potential energy into mechanical energy, motive energy convert into electrical energy. Every time there's a loss, electrical energy transmitted comes to your house, gets converted from electricity to heat. When you convert electricity to heat, generally you lose 70% of energy. You get only 30% as heat. On the other hand, you start with gas. You start with the same potential energy, you burn. Even if you lose 30% of the energy by convection and all that, you get 70%. And because you boil water using gas, you're not going to boil every time you make a cup of coffee. You will boil once and keep in a thermos flask. You take hot water from the thermos flask. So you think through, and you will find out that it's quite stupid to continue boiling water using electric gas. So action is required. We need immediate energy audits to identify inefficiencies. We need to identify energy efficiencies that are possible. Implement such measures. No use identifying if you don't do. For example, when we work with these 50 householders, we give them suggestions. Low-cost options, some cost options, and some that require real effort. The low-cost options were things like, for example, switch off your lights. Bring your air conditioning setting higher. Switch off your air conditioning when you don't need it. This don't cost you anything. Then little cost one will be, you have a lousy aircon, better get it repaired and update, because make it more efficient. You have a lousy refrigerator, buy an energy efficient refrigerator. But the biggest problem we found, we couldn't get people to change out of the 50 households when we asked them to change their transport mode. We suggested to them many options. Only 3 people did out of the 50. One sold his car and bought a motorcycle and started going to work by motorcycle. The other person started walking to his office, which was not very far away. And I can't remember what the third person did, but the majority don't want to do anything on transport. That is the biggest hit. And that, I think, is a real challenge. To me, that is a great potential. And the simplest thing I tell people is when you reduce your ecological footprint, switch from private car to public transport. Major difference you will make. Fundamental review of the energy sources we utilize. Switch to more efficient and cleaner fuels in processes where you can. Have a long-term commitment to environmental quality. And remember, I've always argued, energy use must improve environmental quality, not degenerate it. If it degenerates environmental quality, then there's something wrong with the energy usage. And that's why I come to my favorite, turn to public transport. Greenhouse gas emissions can be large if we can take 50% of the Malaysian cars off the roads. Definitely there will be less jams, transport services will improve, but there's an urgent need to improve integration, timeliness, and user-friendliness. Like to come here, I had to make a decision. I took a bus, but I wasn't sure whether the bus was going to come to Jalan Pandang. So I had to get up at Jalan University and walk in, sort of thing. But why do we have to make these decisions? Why can't we be very clear whether this particular bus is going to, because these fellows keep on changing the routes. Otherwise, I have ended up going to Mid Valley and I would have a headache coming back from Mid Valley. The other alternative would have been to stop at University Hospital and then further away. So I said, take this. So these are daily decisions you make when you take public transport. Well, why do we have to do that? And I'm not even sure what time the bus would come. That's why I went there at 8:15, hoping that the bus would come by 8:30. I was lucky the bus came by 8:30. And this is why it is a transport CO2 emission per person in Asian cities. Although the figures 1990, I'm told, they haven't changed comparatively. If you look at that, where is Kuala Lumpur? Kuala Lumpur is the 4th column from your left, and you look at Seoul, is the 4th column from the right. You see, Seoul's emissions are much less. Population of Seoul is almost the same, but they have a better public transport system. People use public transport much more often. Although they have cars, they also have a high density. And the reason is very clear. Energy used by different transport modes. Passenger, motorcycles, cars, rail. But the next is my most favorite, the cycling. And this is taken from a Dutch NGO. Cyclists can travel 5 kilometers on energy of 1 egg. Person walking, 3 eggs. Loaded cars, 2 dozen eggs. A typical car, 7 dozen eggs. So even if you double the efficiency of the car and double the occupancy of the car, it will still require the energy of 21 eggs. So the moral of the story, for distances up to 5 kilometers, cycling is the most energy efficient. Where are the facilities? So let me end up very quickly and say, why is energy conservation slow in Malaysia? One, my argument remains all this year, energy prices are too low. Little savings are achieved by the big losers.
Remove subsidies.
Yeah, eliminate subsidies. Right? But the government has introduced more subsidies yesterday. National and even corporate planning is more supply side driven. That is my other problem here. Our planning is supply side driven, never demand side driven. And I've been arguing it must be demand side driven. And environmental, especially climate change concerns, still lag behind economic and even social considerations. I'll sit down here and take any quick questions in there. Thank you.
Any questions from the
PR exercise. It was interesting. I was the only person critical of nuclear. I was sandwiched between Zamzam and the chap from Nuclear Malaysia. And I think the other thing we should press very strongly, which is within our right, which is consistent with the Freedom of Information Act, is ask for the Nuclear Malaysia or which regulatory authority to publish the monitoring, radiation monitoring results. These are not made public. Apparently there's something in the law that prohibits them. I'm finding it very strange. Is there a law that prohibits them from publishing this? If that's the case, then that law needs to be changed.
Yes. Thank you. The mic is.
Good morning. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Like Gurmit, I'm an energy efficiency nut, I would call myself. But there's a number of things that we should look at. Number one, even this morning's presentations, some of the figures given are rather debatable from a technical perspective. And sometimes the public, if they get figures that don't add up, you tend to be very dismissive of those figures and you lose confidence in those facts. For example, the question of wastage of energy. Primary energy to electricity, 70%, 60%. That is the worst case situation. In Malaysia, I believe it is a smaller figure, but you can't consider it waste because of conversion efficiency requirements. Now, the other thing about nuclear, we must look at it rather dispassionately. I know that Fukushima has been a disaster, we'll hear more about it, but let's look at renewable energy, particularly when it comes to solar photovoltaic. Solar photovoltaic, 1,000 megawatts of solar photovoltaic will never produce 1,000 megawatts of power, and it may do that for only about half an hour a day. So the maximum will be about 75 to 80%. And 1,000 megawatts of solar will probably produce about 1,200 gigawatts of electricity, whereas one
Malaysian IT company, publicly listed in Singapore. He divested all his shares in the company to serve the community full-time and take part in socio-political affairs of Malaysia. He's currently the director of Invest Penang and the author of the book, The Tiger That Lost Its Roar, on Malaysia's political economy. With that, now I call upon Tony to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Haji Mohideen, Hilary, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me here this morning to talk about one of the most heated topics you have today on IPPs. I still remember probably 5-6 years ago when you talk about complaints about electricity prices, especially. The first party you would blame would be TMPs. TMP. That's the first party, first organization that anybody, including politicians, would blame in the event of price hikes in electricity. But today, TMP tends not to take the flag anymore. The IPPs are taking the flag, and that also shows a greater amount of understanding. It's not complete, but a greater amount of understanding of how electricity prices and structure works in this country. There was a conversation about, a brief one about subsidies just now, whether to abolish or to retain. I think there's no question that in the longer term, the bulk of the subsidies will have to be removed. But the removal of subsidy will also have to commensurate or be balanced with the ability, the availability of facilities and resources to enable people to use alternatives. The best example would be fuel subsidies. Fuel subsidies are, our petrol is subsidized, yeah. But if you are not subsidized, what will happen will be people will still be using cars. Why? Because, as Gurmit himself said just now, it is an absolute pain to be using public transport in this country at this point in time. And at least you have some form of transport in Klang Valley. In most other cities and towns, they are hardly in existence. So there are a lot of problems and alternatives that actually needs to be set up, put in place, before such subsidies can gradually be removed, so that people then have an option to switch. In Singapore, for example, there are no fuel subsidies, there are even fuel taxes. But at least if you don't use a car, you have an efficient bus and MRT train system to be able to get to work without any problems. And even in places without buses and trains, you can fly a taxi at any point in time. But here, the option is not available, and hence the continued dependence, and understandably so, on fuel subsidies. Now, coming back to IPPs, the amount of subsidies taken by IPPs are huge. Huge. They are up to, depending on the gas prices, they are up to as much as about 8 billion ringgit a year. At its peak, it was close to 8 billion ringgit a year. That was in 2008, 8.1 billion ringgit. In 2010, it was 6.2, and last year, if I'm not wrong, the estimates are in excess of 7 billion ringgit. That's the amount of subsidies being paid directly to IPPs. Now, the controversy over subsidy to IPPs is this. According to IPPs, these subsidies are complete pass-through to consumers. According to politicians like us, we blame the subsidies for enriching the IPPs without much affecting the prices to end consumers. Okay, that is the exact conflict that's happening now. We are blaming, why are you subsidizing the IPPs? No, why are you not subsidizing the people? If you are removing subsidies, why aren't you removing subsidies from the IPPs? The IPP's argument and the government's argument is, hey, these subsidies are passed through to tenaga, which are passed through to the users, so they are not actually benefiting the IPPs. Now, which one is true? Which one is false? Or is it somewhere in between? The best way to identify if an IPP is passing through all the so-called subsidies to the end users is to find a relative comparison. And we actually have a pretty decent comparison with Thailand. I mean, when to compare IPPs and energy costs, one of the things you need to take into consideration is the energy and fuel mix. You know, whether you are using a lot of gas, a lot of coal, a lot of diesel, petroleum products to generate electricity. That creates different cost bases in the generation of electricity. So we have a pretty good match together with Thailand, where the amount of gas used to generate electricity is largely similar to Malaysia, which is between 60 to 70% gas. Okay, then they have what do you call it? They have about 21% in coal. Hydro takes up about 5%. So it's very similar between Thailand and Malaysia. Thailand subsidizes its gas as well. Okay, but it subsidizes its gas at a lower rate than that of Malaysia. In Malaysia, before the recent price hike, the subsidy for gas, the price of gas to IPPs is 10 ringgit 40 cents per MMBTU, million British thermal units of gas. In Thailand, it's 23 ringgit 10 cents per MMBTU, more than double the cost of gas after subsidy to IPPs. Okay? The recent price hikes resulted in the lowering of subsidies of gas to IPPs, the recent price hike in July. So the new price being paid by IPPs in Malaysia for gas is still much lower than Thailand. 13 ringgit 70 cents per MMBTU. That is the price being paid by IPPs to Petronas for supply of gas to generate electricity today. Okay, Thailand is still 23 ringgit 10 cents. Now, based on the same fuel mix structure, okay, the very simple outcome that we are expecting will be, we will be proportionately cheaper, assuming equal efficiency between the IPPs in Thailand and in Malaysia. We will be expecting cheaper electricity in Malaysia relative to Thailand. I think it's simple as that. You have greater subsidies, you enjoy lower prices, your electricity should be cheaper than in Thailand. But that is completely not the case. In fact, not only are we not proportionately cheaper than in Thailand, and based on calculations not by me, but by Pemandu themselves. Okay, this is calculation by Pemandu themselves. Our electricity prices should be at least 17% cheaper than in Thailand. Okay, assuming equal efficiency, our electricity prices should be at least 17% cheaper than in Thailand. But what we have today is our electricity is actually marginally more expensive than that in Thailand. Why is that? Average, I'll give an example, the average commercial rates, that means if you are using shop lots to do small businesses and stuff, you are paying in Malaysia an average of about 40 ringgit per kilowatt hour, whereas in Thailand it is 38 ringgit per kilowatt hour. The only reason why that's happening is because the subsidies given to IPPs allows them to maintain a reasonable electricity price, but the bulk of the subsidies are actually going towards the profits of the IPPs. So what the subsidy does is they're actually masking, okay, the fact, masking the profits that the IPPs are making, giving a reasonable electricity price, because 40 ringgit per kilowatt hour is cheap, is relatively cheap, no? But the full extent of the subsidies is not passed through to the man on the street, to the people.
Rent collecting by fat cats.
So why is that happening? How is that profit being captured by the IPPs? Okay, the profits are being captured because of, very simply, very unfair agreements. I'll just go quote a phrase from Tan Sri Aniano, who was the chairman of TMB when the first IPP contracts were signed. He was extremely upset. If you have read some of his interviews, he said that when he's brought to EPU to negotiate with the IPPs, he was treated like dirt. Any objections he made will immediately be reported to the top, and then the calls will come down that you just go ahead and do what is necessary. As in, to EPU to do what is necessary, regardless of the objections by TMB. Okay, this is a quote from Tan Sri Aniano, which was taken in 2006. He has actually said more things recently. At 16 cents per unit kilowatt. Now this was the price that Tenaga has to buy electricity from the IPP, 16 cents per unit. With take or pay situation, this I'll explain later, actually it was 23 cents per unit. With 23 cents plus transmission and distribution costs, TMB would have had to charge the consumer no less than 30 cents per unit. If mixed with TMB's cost, the cost would come down, but was at our expense because we were producing, TMB themselves, at the point of signing the IPP contracts, we were producing electricity at 8 cents a unit. Okay? And we can deliver at 17 cents. So TMB could deliver their electricity at 17 cents, while the IPPs, when they come in for TMB to break even after buying electricity on the electricity purchased from the IPPs, TMB has to sell it at 30 cents. That's where the gap is. Now what's this take or pay thing? And it is quite unique to Malaysia, especially for the early IPP contracts. What's this take or pay thing? Now EPU, with all its charts and calculations, will decide, Malaysia by 2008, that time was sometime in the mid-90s, by 2008 will require X amount of energy. So we need to build all the plants to supply this amount of energy. Okay? Now the condition of signing with IPPs is not only must you pay 16 cents, okay, for this electricity per unit, you must pay for all installed capacity regardless of whether TNB managed to sell or not to sell this electricity. It means that if I were to build a 1,000 megawatt plant, IPP plant, okay, power producing plant, should the demand only be 800 megawatt, TNB still have to pay for the excess 200 megawatt. Now, how big is this excess? How big is this excess? The argument by the government is very simple. We all need excess. We do not want another repeat of the 1996, if I'm not wrong, electricity failure that affected the entire Peninsular Malaysia. No, so you need a margin so that if there's excess of demand, you can cope with the excess demand. Now that's universally accepted that you need excess capacity. Okay, you need excess capacity. Now what is the norm for this excess capacity? If you read a lot of the energy literature out there, they will tell you that capacity that's required usually 15 to 20% to be safe and sufficient. Now, a lot of countries are a lot more conservative than that. Okay? Thailand, for example, 25.8%. Indonesia, Java Island, at least the statistics I have is for Java Island, 26%. United States and Canada, 28.6%. UK, 30%. So you can see that the range seems to be between developing and developed countries, 25 to 30%. Now for Malaysia, 2008, the excess capacity, reserve margin, 54.6%. That is exactly where the wasted energy goes to. And that's a lot of wasted energy because whatever excess energy produced, there's no battery in the world that will be able to store it for use another day. It's just gone. But and Tenaga and yourself are paying for this extra capacity. Okay? And that's one of the reasons why there's a very urgent need for reforms in the energy industry in Malaysia, energy production industry, particularly by the IPPs in this country. I will list a few measures that we want to do and we should do. Okay? Number one, I think all these unfair contracts needs to be restructured. I don't think there's a question about it. It's a question of political will. The response given by government against restructuring these existing contracts is very simple. We must respect the sanctity of these contracts. Now, we are a country of law, rule of law. We cannot simply breach contracts anytime we like. This will make investors not like us anymore. This will result in loss of foreign investments, etc. Now, we have called for these contracts to be made public. Now, what we have done, we have successfully done that for highway contracts. Okay? And what we notice in all these privatization contracts is there's always an escape clause in these contracts. The government has an option to expropriate these plants. And usually, okay, the formula used for expropriation is the cost of construction of these plants plus whatever a certain degree of reasonable profits, usually set at 12%, okay, for these companies. 12% return is actually very reasonable. But the problem is these companies are making returns often close to 40–50% per annum. So there's a strong resistance to sell it back to government. Why sell it back to government, okay, and I don't get any more profit when every year I get returns of 40–50%? The government is refusing to release the details of this contract. And we believe that it is because there are existing escape clauses that allows the government to actually take back these IPPs, okay, at a very, very reasonable cost. Much cheaper than what it would be if we continue to have them in service. Okay? That's number one. So you need to restructure these contracts. And there has been restructuring in many places throughout the world. Australia and Canada have restructured their IPP contracts because they realized that when they first went into these IPP contract arrangements, everyone didn't know anything, and they realized that they were giving too much profits to IPPs, and as part of public pressure and renegotiation, they actually restructured the IPP contracts with consent from the IPP parties. So there was restructuring, and it did not affect investor interest in places like Australia or Canada. Okay, I'm pretty sure other countries may have, but from what I know, in Australia and Canada, they have restructured IPP contracts. Number two, you must inject competition into the industry. How do you inject competition into the industry? In Malaysia, they say we are competing. See, we have Malakoff, we have PowerTech, we have Genting Sanyan, we have
YTL
Power. They are competing. We have a lot of IPP companies, but none of them are competing with one another. Why? Because contracts are signed on a unilateral basis on directives from the EPU department. Since when is there competition? I want to buy 1,000 megawatts, I just talk to YTL. I don't talk to anyone else. So we have many companies, but none of them are competing with one another. And that is similar to the telecommunications industry, where we have, in the past, landlines, where we have many companies, but how they compete is, okay, Mount Kiara zone, Maxis. This Oakland Road zone, Telkom Malaysia. Another zone, another company. So you have multiple companies, but each with concessionary terms that are not competing with one another. We actually need to open it up for competition. Now, does it work, opening up for competition?
No.
And believe it or not, Thailand, which is so-called a less developed country than Malaysia, has been running on a competitive IPP policy over the past 15 years. How do they compete? Very simple. I want to fix my energy mix. I want to say I want to use clean energy, use gas. Fine. How much subsidy I'm going to provide is state upfront. Now, which party, which company can provide this amount of electricity to me over this period of time at a price lower than this? Whoever gives lower price, we will take it from the IPP. Simple. Open tenders are actually called for energy provision to the main energy company. And whoever wins the bid, contracts are awarded. Now that's the only way to ensure that the companies remain efficient. Because IPPs actually have to be efficient. If my price of gas, my price of electricity sale is so high, I don't need to be very efficient in order to make a lot of money. I can waste energy, I'm going to buy the most efficient technology to save energy, to make a lot of money. But if it is competitive, my margins are thin, reasonable but thin, I have to make sure that I invest in the best energy saving mechanism to prevent loss of fuel. And this is highly crucial for the industry in order to be energy efficient. Do I have 5 minutes?
15 seconds.
The Bridges and Malakoff. My question is very simple. We now have a matured IPP industry. We have at least 8 to 10 IPP companies, big and small, out there. Why didn't we open up this plant, 1,000 megawatt plant, for open competition to the people out there? There was no reply. Because we have reasons and they have invested and they are giving good price. The always answer back is, Malakoff is really giving a good price and therefore we don't have to call open tender. To me, only open tenders will give you the best pricing for tenaga in any circumstances. 2 more points. One, in the longer term, how should energy, the market be structured in this country? The biggest problem at this point in time, if you're talking about monopoly, we have one in terms of distribution, only tenaga. Industry has changed in UK, in US, such that the only monopoly portion that has been identified is the grid, your grid across the entire country. Now it is ridiculous if you have 3 companies competing, you have 3 national grids running through the entire country. The cost of investment will be overwhelming. Now the way these countries have done is the grid is nationalized. It belongs to a national-owned agency or corporation, okay? Because that's where the cost is. Everyone else compete to supply electricity. Now, to what extent the competition can be? I can go to a supermarket, just like you go to a supermarket today, to buy your prepaid card, top up. Today I want to buy telecom because it's cheaper, got offer. Tomorrow I want to buy DG because it's cheaper, got offer. and all you need to do is scratch the number, key it in, and you can use your phone. There's interchangeability. What they do in UK is actually, they also buy a code, they go back home, the meter, punch in the code, and then electricity flows. So you buy 10 ringgit of electricity, 20 ringgit of electricity, and the companies compete. And they all get charged the same rate of rental to use the transmission line operated by the government. So that way will help lower, in my view, will make the industry more efficient, both cost-wise and energy-wise, and the beneficiary will be the man out there who will enjoy more efficient services as well as low cost of electricity. Last one, subsidy mechanism. Coming back to subsidies. Do we need to continue subsidies? I think there's no question that there are segments of society that subsidies are needed. You know, if I own a bungalow, stay in Canning Hills, forget it. These people should not enjoy a single cent of subsidy. Maybe you might want to ask them to pay energy tax as well. But for many who are living in villages, who are living close to subsistence levels, or even the lower middle income group, they need some form of subsidies. And it's only fair from a social justice perspective that they receive it. Now, these type of subsidies are best to be granted in a direct fashion, in my view, versus an indirect fashion, that is through the energy producers. Because when you do it indirectly, the energy producers will find ways to distort the mechanism so that the subsidies goes to them directly or indirectly. Okay? Whereas if you go direct to the end users, then we all know that this money will be spent and utilized by the end users themselves, and there will be no leakage of the subsidy mechanism. So these are the various points of reforms that I believe are needed and necessary to change our energy sector for 3 reasons. 1, so that the sector can become more competitive and efficient from a technology perspective. 2, because it will naturally make more energy efficient companies. And 3, because it will actually bring the most benefits to all Malaysians out there. Thank you. Thank you very much.